So just to start us off for this evening, you're very welcome, everybody who's attending here, to this evening's lecture, The Gnostic Mary Magdalene and the Queering of the Bible by Dudeck. My name is Melissa Boyle, and I'm the director of Rua Red and the curator of the Magdalene Series. This evening's event is really part of a wider engagement programme which surrounds the Magdalene Series at Rua Red. And I know that some of you have been to our previous lectures, but just to give you a bit of context of what the Magdalene Series is at Rua Red, it's a programme of exhibitions, interventions, performances and events in response to the figure of Mary Magdalene. And it started actually quite a long time ago, way back in 2018, before the COVID lockdown and virus was even upon us. And it was through a commissioning process with an invitation to artists that I knew would make really, really interesting, interrogative and challenging work in response to the conflicted and mysterious figure of Mary Magdalene. And it was something that was kind of in my head for many years prior to this. I think it started in 2014. So it has been a long process with the artists, some of which have joined us tonight. And the artists are Amanda Coogan, Rachel Fallon, Alice Maher, Jessie Jones, and Grace Diaz, whose work is actually currently on in Rua Red, the Mary Magdalene Experience, and it runs until the 3rd of February. So I would ask that people come and see the show before it ends in February. So tonight, as part of our wider education and engagement and research programme at Rua Red, we try to create new ways for people to access and experience contemporary art practice through inviting really a wide range of people to interact with the subject matter and themes within the exhibitions and within the Magdalene Series. So tonight, unfortunately, I have to jump off this and go to a board meeting. So I'm really looking forward to watching it later on, whenever I can relax. But without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to the very capable hands of Kimberly. So Kimberly is our Education and Engagement Officer at Rua Red, and Kimberly will introduce as well. And just, I want to say you're very welcome tonight. And I know that we have been in conversation over a number of months. So it's great to see this lecture actually happening this evening. So thank you so much for joining us, and over to you, Kimberly.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And so now I am delighted to introduce Em, who is an artist, religious scholar, and cultural engineer who invents their own queer religion as art. This project, called Religionvirus, has been performed, exhibited, screened, and published in over 30 countries worldwide. Dudeck approaches religion as an artistic medium and employs tactics of fictioning, alternative archaeology, and queer theology in their ongoing efforts to expand the category of the sacred and queer divinity into form. So over to you now, Em, and I am very excited to hear your talk and to follow along as well. So thank you.
Thank you. And hopefully you can hear me. I'm in the countryside and Wi-Fi operates kind of like an ocean here. So if everybody is used to this format now, so if I become if you can't make out what I'm saying, or if my video glitches, there will be intervention. There's strategies in place, but hopefully you can hear and see me okay. But rest assured, if anything glitches, just stay with it, stay with the chaos, and I promise it will roll back in. Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone, and welcome. And thank you to Melissa, and also to Kimberly, also to Francesca and Orna, and everybody at Rua Red who invited me to participate in this very timely and ambitious project, the Magdalene Series. I am going to talk a little bit about my practice before I roll into the entirety, just so everybody is aware of where I'm coming from. And I just wanted to say thank you to my dear friend Alice Maher, who suggested this, and it was a very opportune moment, because I in my practice, I was working on the archetype of Mary Magdalene at the moment that Alice suggested it. So it's quite beautiful to see the depth of engagement with the idea, image, the constellation of ideas, I guess, that surrounds Mary Magdalene. And I'm particularly interested in the notion that Mary Magdalene is an idea before a person in our comprehension. And I think that comes through in a lot of the artists' commissioned artwork from this project. So as Kimberly mentioned, my work as an artist is, oh, sorry, wait, I'm doing a thing. I'm setting myself a timer of 10 minutes to happen 4 times because I have separated my presentation into 4 segments. And sometimes if I'm not careful, I go down rabbit holes, which is often interesting for audience members, but there are several things that we have to get through here today. So I've spent the last 14 years inventing a queer religion as art, and that takes several forms, myriad forms, including ritual performance, museological installation of artifacts and ruins, kind of pseudo-archaeology within the practice. I compose hymns in an invented language. I've also created a queer language that doesn't have any gender pronouns, but it also doesn't have any nouns. Everything is a verb in this language. I'm currently composing a Bible, which will take the form of a graphic novel, which also works with and recodes illuminated manuscripts. I'm also working on a VR project right now to create a chapel in virtual reality, which I will also talk about toward at the end of this talk. So I approach religion as a form of multimedia production. And I'm an artist. I've been doing this for 14 years. I'm also a scholar of religion, but I'm a scholar of religion in order to make art about religion. I research, I go deep into the history of religion, and I use it as source code to remix a kind of a new religious narrative for the information age. I'm particularly fond of a model that emerges from an American philosopher named Ian Bogost. He wrote a book called Alien Phenomenology, or What It's Like to Be a Thing. Sorry, just checking the time. And in this, he proposes a model he calls carpentry, which is a philosophical practice of, quote, I'll use his words, making things that explain how things make our world, end quote. So it articulates that if you are interested in something, one of the most helpful ways to learn about it is to make it yourself, to explore how it's made, to explore how it's constructed. So using a Bogostian framework, I would say that I'm constructing a religion in order to understand how religions are constructed. But I'm also a performance artist. So I would add to that to say that I'm constructing a religion in order to perform how religions are constructed. And tonight on Zoom, this is a lecture performance. I'm employing a strategy to try and perform this while I talk to you about it. My project is called Religionvirus. It utilizes viral aesthetics in order to speak about the way in which religion moves from host body to host body across cultural vectors. And in my approach, I've been a hybrid scholar of religion for also 14 years. During my practice-based PhD at Edinburgh College of Art, I actually got enough nerve to produce my own definition of religion, what a religion is from the perspective of an artist who is constructing a religion. So this is my definition. A religion at its core, is a form of multimedia production that is capable of inspiring beliefs, generating worldviews, and engineering cultures. So when I try and explain this model, I use an analogy, let's just say, of going to church on a Sunday for a Sunday service. First of all, the architecture of the space has been designed according to spiritual principles. Sometimes it's just a building, but more often than not, it's been designed based upon spiritual principles, but it's also been designed for acoustics and for sound, for music to be able to have a certain effect. And then the walls are lined with two-dimensional or three-dimensional depictions of the mythology that's central to the religion. And then there's a priest and possibly others who are going to officiate a ritual, and they are clothed in vestments or robes, or we might even say costume, in order to perform this and present it. Then you sit down and there's a book, and this book has aspects of the mythology written, but it also has a section, or there's another book like a psalter that actually takes the mythology, the stories of the mythology, the words, and puts it to music. And there's notation so that you as an audience member can sing along. Then, of course, the priest and possibly their team, they exegete the core mythology and make it applicable to the congregation. So this is just a quick analogy, because I suspect, I do believe we have some religious scholars with us today, but we also have a lot of artists. This is a total artwork, a Gesamtkunstwerk. This is a total production. And when all of those elements are working well and right, I believe they have the capacity to produce a religious experience. Checking time again, it keeps logging me out of the phone. Okay, 3 minutes, good. And as an artist producing a religion, constructing a religion, I'm keenly interested in what ingredients are necessary in order to inspire belief. And over the course of, as stated, my Religionvirus project has been presented in over 30 countries, and after many of my ritual performances, audience members have come up to me to say, I had a religious experience in your performance. And that was notable because it sort of continuously reoccurred. That particular language was used. I had a religious experience. And this was very typically from secular publics, people who did not intend on having a religious experience. And that's what led me to my practice-based PhD, to try and probe and understand, okay, well, what particular ingredients transmedial ingredients are required to produce a religious experience? And this is where I came to this notion of religion as a multimedia production. It requires a number of art forms collaborating together to produce this kind of experience. So lastly, I wanted to just say, I've been talking about the Bogosti model and this idea of constructing a religion. I came of age as an artist in the early 2000s at the dawn of the new millennium, and I was deeply aware of, as myself as an inheritor of the legacy of postmodernism. And fundamentally postmodernist deconstruction of the grand narratives, of the metanarratives, the harmful stories that shape our entire conception of reality. And I was taught in the postmodernist tradition to deconstruct these systems, that was our sacred charge, let's say, as cultural producers. But I'm also of a new generation, potentially millennial generation, and I'm interested in the idea of reconstruction, which has been theorized from multiple vantage points, including metamodernist and performatist kind of viewpoints. But the idea here that after deconstruction, after the violence of those meta-narratives has been properly unearthed and examined, there is a new instinct emerging in this new millennium to put those pieces back together and start reconstructing. Not necessarily meta-narratives that shape our conception of reality, but as artworks that probe and explore the ways in which these grand narratives shape our very conception of reality. Fundamentally, I am a queer artist that is producing a religion. And as mentioned, there is, as mentioned, I am interested in this notion of expanding the category of the sacred, but also, yeah, that's my 10-minute mark. 1 second. I'm going to stop with that because it keeps me going off. There is a notion that by reconstructing this as a queer artist, I am also attempting to heal a lot of the damage that was done. Yeah, sorry, I got a notification. I'm trying to heal a lot of the damage that is done by religion in general, excluding queer people. Religions of all sorts exclude queer people from access to divinity. So I'm also interested in sort of taking the aspects of religion that are applicable and helpful and interesting, and reapplying them in a queer way to show that not only do queer people have access to divinity, but arguably, and this is also dangerous because of queer historiography and looking back on the past with the lens of the present, but arguably religion has always been queer. It's been the province of gender confusion, same-sex communities. But sorry, I'm going to leave that because that I'm getting alerted in myself. That's a rabbit hole. So on to the next part, the queering of the Bible. I'm going to invoke a queer biblical scholar named Ken Stone, who wrote a passionate plea for contemporary cultural producers to performatively queer the Bible. And this lecture tonight is in honor of that call, or an answer to that call. But I would argue, and I will argue throughout this talk, that the Magdalene Series is also doing this. We are collectively queering the Bible by talking about it and repositioning it, by complicating it, and by using it as sort of source code to analyze our contemporary present. Ken Stone invoked Judith Butler in his essay. And I suspect most of you would be aware of Butler's work, particularly with gender. But one of the most important things that she contributed in terms of gender, and I'm going to quote, is that gender is, quote, something continuously done as if to conform to an original. But by this very doing, it creates the original. So when someone says boys don't cry, it just maybe comes out of their mouth because they've heard it 5 million times in their life. But by saying it, every time you say it, you reproduce that reality. The same thing applies to the Bible. The Bible. First of all, it is not a singular thing, the Bible. When someone says, the Bible says that man shall not lie with another man, or anything that someone might say the Bible is saying, is ontologically incorrect. Because first of all, Bible comes from biblia. Think of bibliothèque. It's a book of books. It's a library. So if I said the public library says that chicken soup heals the common cold, that it's not, the public library hasn't decided on this statement. I might have found a few books in the library that say that chicken soup helps heal the cold, but the authoritative library is not deciding on that singular fact. and this is part of queering the Bible, is problematizing that and exposing people to the fact that the Bible is not cohesive or singular. It is many books that are written by many different people. Many of them contradict each other. They're written centuries apart, and the Bible that we have was a very strategically selected group of texts that has a singular kind of focus. But within that, there is so much difference. And yeah, so I think it's important to say this because that this is part of what the talk was presented as, is queering the Bible, performatively queering the Bible. My practice of inventing my own queer religion as art is a queering of the Bible itself. Of course, I'm producing my own Bible. That is a very obvious way of doing it. But what we are doing here today is also fundamentally fulfilling, I believe, Ken Stone's request of us. So I'm going to roll into the Gnostic Mary Magdalene. So what you're seeing is my reconstructive method, the way in particular in which I reconstruct iconographic material for the Religionvirus. So what the image underneath that you're seeing is a Renaissance painting by Paolo Veronese, dated to 1545, and it's called The Conversion of Mary Magdalene. And what you're seeing happen over top is the way in which I utilize the source code of this image in order to reproduce or reconstruct a new iconography that you'll see as it develops is a lot more psychedelic and cyberpunk than its original referent. And it's also fundamentally quite a bit more queer. So this is, while I'm talking, you are watching and participating in a kind of a queer reconstructive method. Now, if in addition to what you're seeing is the visual representation of the ways in which I queer the Bible and recode this archetypal material. But I also am a writer, and I'm composing a whole mythology that remixes these themes. So the figures that you're seeing, which are typically recognizable, I also am reconstructing them archetypally in my mythology. So as I mentioned, I was working on the figure of Mary Magdalene when dear Alice contacted me, which was a fortuitous moment, and I was recomposing this character. Now, my archetypes are composite, so my Mary Magdalene character also takes from other semi-historical and biblical figures, which I will mention. But at the core, I'm interested in remixing the dominant motif that we all grew up with Mary Magdalene in a noticeable way, so that audience members who may or may not know precisely what I'm doing as an artist, they will likely recognize certain motifs. But being a religious scholar is enormously convenient because I don't need to reinvent the wheel. There were many complex, competing, different narratives that were circulating in the ancient Near East. What we have in the Bible is only a sort of a section, a curated section of material. So the Gnostic Mary Magdalene is a massive source of inspiration to me. And I am going to briefly introduce the Gnostic Mary Magdalene for this conversation, so that you can see the ways in which I am remixing this material. Now, the challenge here, and forgive me, any religious scholars in the audience, please forgive me, because I am going to move very fast through some very complicated material. And for those of you who are new to Gnosticism, this might also be a little bit confusing and overwhelming. So that's another reason that I wanted the video to be going, so that you can watch the process, even if it's a bit much for me to be summarizing such a complex and disputed history. But it's just important to understand that in the ancient world, there were alternative perspectives on the dominant religion of the day, just as there is now. So the Gnostics, I will use a model from a religious scholar named April Dudeck, who wrote a book called The Gnostic New Age, and she finds there to be a lot of parallels between what we would call New Age and what was existing in the ancient Near East under the rubric, under the lens of Gnosticism. So New Age, if I say New Age, I'm sure a lot of thoughts come to mind, probably yoga and chakras, but possibly also neo-paganism, etc. It's an umbrella term. It doesn't describe any particular spiritual viewpoint, but it is situating an alternative spiritual viewpoint to the dominant narrative. Gnosticism we can read in a very similar light. However, and again, this is what I promise not to do, some scholars argue that Gnosticism was the original form of Christianity, but there's endless debate circling around this, which we don't have time for today. There are two key factors for Gnosticism that are relevant to us today. The first is that they perceived that God, the God of the Israelites, the Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, and also arguably the new God, is not, in fact, the supreme entity. It's not the total God. In fact, it's a bit of a faker, a scam. They refer to this God as the demiurge. There is, according to the Gnostics, there is a kind of a divine field, a more profound God that has created the whole universe. But the God that we know has created this reality and has also created it as a kind of prison for the soul. The second important thing about the Gnostics is their emphasis on gnosis, what we call gnosis, which it's the Greek word for knowledge, but it's not knowledge in the sense of reading books and getting information. It's the type of knowledge that you can only get from direct experience. And they argued that the only way to know God was through direct experience, introspection, exploration of one's soul. And this is why it was very dangerous and threatening for the church, because it basically said that you don't need the church, you don't need organized religion, you don't need priests. It's all about your own exploration of God. So if you're with me still, there's a critical story, a kind of a cosmogony moment that is quite important, according to Valentinus, who is one of the major Gnostic, let's just say, artists who sculpted this perception of reality. So when the divine field, the ultimate God, was exploring themselves, they produced these emanations, which we could understand to be kind of spiritual constellations that were going to explore themselves. And it's not a he, it's definitely a they or an it. They separated these emanations into groups of two, male and female, and sent them out into the cosmos to explore. But Sophia, which is the Greek word for wisdom, she didn't want a partner. She didn't want to be a pair in a syzygy, because the original God, the creator being who is setting forth all the syzygies, he didn't have another. He was himself. They were themselves. So Sophia attempted to do it herself. However, this failed, and it failed. It even caused an abortion. So she had to abort a being, and that being fell out of her and fell down and ended up creating material reality, the lower world that all of us live in. Potentially even created the possibility for incarnation. And Sophia was, you can visualize it, that she was pulled down by the gravity of this, and she fell also into the lower world. But she took with her divine sparks. And there's a beautiful image that it's like shattered glass. Everything in our existence has a shard or a piece or sand embedded in our skin. We have this divinity embedded within us in this horrible prison, according to the Gnostics. And that's thanks to Sophia. So the Gnostics saw themselves as the children of Sophia. And this is important as we approach Magdalene. They referred to her by the following names. They called her the All-Mother, the Celestial Eve, the Holy Spirit, she of the left hand. They also referred to Christ as he of the right hand, the daughter of life, the world soul, the soul in man. And most exciting for my queer purposes, they referred to Sophia as the man woman. Now, this is important. Retain this. Sophia was referred to as the man woman. Now, yeah, sorry, just lost my spot for a second. So it's important to briefly understand Sophia, the perspective of Sophia from the Gnostics, because they read Mary Magdalene through the lens of Sophia. And this is also very critical to think about, because, all of the artists in this show were exploring as feminists, Mary Magdalene, and potentially also reclaiming Mary Magdalene from the patriarchy, which coded her in a very specific oppressive light. But it's important to understand that in the ancient Near East, there were those, I guess we could also argue, proto-feminist, that were reading her in a similar way, competing against the patriarchal sort of dominant readings that we are used to. So briefly, we didn't know that much about, we knew about Gnosticism largely from those who wrote against it, because it was considered a heresy. Gnostics were burned, and so were all of their documents that weren't included. But in 1945 in Egypt, we discovered the Nag Hammadi scriptures, which was a series of jars, earthenware jars, that were unearthed, that contained 52 gospels. 52 Gnostic Gospels. And these were illegal texts that that none of us, very few of them did we have access to. So when we got these texts in 1945, we developed a far more nuanced understanding of the Gnostics. In 5 of these Gospels, Mary Magdalene figures prominently. Now, I'm just going to look at time here. Okay. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. If any of them are of interest to you, I would be happy to talk about them further, also in the Q&A. But pay attention to the way in which Mary Magdalene is portrayed based upon what I've told you a little bit about Sophia. So the first we have is the Gospel of Philip. And this one is kind of famous because of the Da Vinci Code. Fortunately or unfortunately, Dan Brown did do his research, even if he changed a bunch of things. But I do the same in my Religionvirus, so I don't judge. But in this one, Mary is depicted as Christ's chief disciple, higher than any of the other apostles. And it contains a rare passage which implies an intimacy between Christ and Magdalene that goes beyond the sort of typical apostolic relationship. Quote, "And the companion of the Savior was Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth," end quote. Now, of course, the word mouth is actually missing in the document. So it says he used to kiss her on the, and we have we're missing that section, but many scholars think that the word is mouth. This, of course, it has this fueled the Da Vinci Code and the whole story that, possibly Christ was married. But it matters not to us whether they were together. It matters that people were writing and thinking about this at a certain point. The next mention of her here is when the apostles, and this happens all the time in these Gospels, the apostles are just constantly complaining to Jesus, "Why do you love Mary more than us?" To which Christ responds, quote, "Why do I not love you like her? When a blind man and one who sees are both together in darkness, they are no different from one another. When the light comes, he who sees will see the light, and he who is blind will remain in darkness." This is important in relation to Sophia because we can see that Magdalene is equated as the bringer of light, becoming the Gnostic mother, or the mother of angels. This is a direct reference to Sophia. So they are talking about Sophia through Mary Magdalene. The next gospel is the dialogue of the Savior, and this is a very badly damaged text from the 2nd century that tells of the origins of the world and natural history. And it's another segment where a number of followers are asking Christ a lot of questions, but Mary is the one who is asking the most questions, and hers are the most rich and deep. We have another gospel called the Pistis Sophia, which translates to the faith of Sophia. It's from the 4th century, and it narrates the fall of Sophia into the lower realm. So do you remember I talked about the abortion, and then I see it as like almost the gravity pulled her down. It describes that. And again, Jesus is asked, "Why do you love Mary so much more than us?" And he says, quote, "Her heart is more directed to the kingdom of heaven, and she is superior to the other disciples," end quote. Then we have the Gospel of Thomas, which scholars believe was written around the same time as the 4 canonical Gospels, and it contains 114 sayings of Christ. Mary Magdalene is mentioned twice. First, she's asking some questions about Christ's disciples. But then, and this is very interesting, Peter says to Jesus, quote, "Make Mary leave us, for females do not deserve life," end quote. It's quite disturbing. And then Jesus responds, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, this is a feminist project, and of course, when you first hear this, you just hear more evidence of a patriarchal viewpoint. But it's important to say that in the Hellenistic times, it was typical to describe the essence of form as male and its material element as female. So to become male was commonplace to describe becoming spiritual and pure. So I just invite you to also think about the description of Sophia as a man-woman, as a merging of the two. And also, if you are familiar with alchemy, a lot of the models that described sort of spiritual development and transformation was depicted in the form of a hermaphrodite, sort of the masculine and feminine being in balance with one another. But I'm also very interested in this queerness, because we're also describing here the process of Mary Magdalene becoming male in a world that was, that itself was very, very male oriented, that women did not have a lot of the powers that we might have now. Lastly, there's the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and half of this gospel is missing, unfortunately. I do believe, actually, that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is figures in Grace Dias's work in the Magdalene series. I've not yet seen the film, but I'm very excited to. Karen King, who's a dominant scholar of Gnosticism, she believes that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene might even have been written during the time of Christ or shortly thereafter. And here again, Jesus answers more questions, but he then disappears after the resurrection, and all of the apostles are in a panic, emotionally and foundationally broken and afraid. What do we do? Mary Magdalene takes charge of the moment and says, quote, "Do not weep and do not grieve, nor be irresolute, for his grace will be entirely with you and will protect you. But rather let us praise his greatness, for he has prepared us and made us into men." When Mary did this, she turned their hearts to the good, and she began to discuss the words of the Savior. Okay, so now let's switch off the video, Francesca. That's okay. Thank you. Okay, so I needed to ground the Mary Magdalene, the Gnostic Mary Magdalene, in order to be able to talk about the way that I archetypally recode and remix her positionality. And what I find quite interesting, as I mentioned, is there is a lot of language around female and male, but not necessarily in terms of sex or gender. And I don't have time to go into it, but these conceptions in the ancient world were more like spiritual conditions rather than the associations that we have of maleness and femaleness in our current cycle. In my mythology, in my queer invented religion, all beings are transgendered, and in fact, gender and biology is even constantly being transformed by the characters. So all of the figures in my mythology are they. Many of them have several breasts, which are referred to as milk glands. Some of them have several phalli. Sex is not solely for the purpose of reproduction. It's a very complex kind of remixing of even it's a post-gender construct. And I have a central figure, a messianic figure, who is leading violent religious reformation. And when they travel to the first world they conquer, has obviously it has its own religion, it has its own culture, and it's this also it so happens that this new religion is monotheistic of sorts. But the Messiah, when they're taking over the new temple, and this is something that's very important historically as relates to religions, because typically when a new religion moves in to where an old religion was, it doesn't often destroy the remains of the old religion. It reconstructs it. So if anybody has been to the Pantheon in Rome, it's a giant circle, and it has these very gorgeous, obviously gorgeous roof, circular roof, but it has all of these statues of Christian saints. But they were pagan. These statues were literally pagan gods. They didn't make new statues. They just changed the pagan gods into saints. They reconstructed it. So this same thing is happening in my narrative, in my mythology. They're coming into the old religion and they're trying to transform it. They're trying to convert it. And in this religion, there are temple priestesses who are also prostitutes. And one of the highest temple priestesses ends up being converted to the new religion. So what you are watching, that iconographic image, the key figure that I was reconstructing from Mary Magdalene is in fact a high priestess from the new religion who is being converted, from the old religion, who's being converted into the new religion to save their life. Now, it's important to acknowledge one thing about Mary Magdalene, which might be surprising for some people who haven't studied the Bible, is that there's actually no mention at all in the Bible of Mary Magdalene being a prostitute. That happened much later in the Middle Ages with it's Pope Gregory the Great, who cherry-picked various sections that were describing possibly unnamed prostitutes who Jesus interacted with, and said, no, that was Magdalene. The entire mythology that we have of Mary Magdalene, also the washing his feet with her hair, that person is unnamed in the texts. It's the later sort of ascription onto Mary Magdalene of being a whore, of being a prostitute, that constructed the Mary Magdalene that we collectively understand today. And that's not an accident, because the Gnostics and potentially the Gnostics and others also perceived of Mary as a visionary, and possibly even the chief of all the disciples. And she also had a vision after the resurrection. And this is very dangerous to a patriarchal entity that wants to police who has access to God. So the choice to make her a prostitute and a whore was deliberate in order to disempower the visionary capacities of her as, Christ's number one. So this also enters into my own mythology in an important way. And I'm going to blast you with one other surprising biblical fact, and then I'm going to tie it all in, and then we'll go to a conversation. But in the ancient Near East, the context in which the Jesus story and also the story of Jerusalem, the story of the Jews, all of this, when this emerges, we have a phenomenon which we refer to as sort of a sacred prostitution. This is also greatly debated within scholarly fields if this was the case, but definitely there were goddesses that had priestesses, as in people with breasts and a vagina, as well as male devotees who very often castrated themselves and occupied what I would call a sort of proto-transgendered positionality as servants of this goddess. This was typical. The Magna Mater is probably the most famous goddess of this kind, who came from Turkey but then came into Rome, and her priests were called the Galli. But then we have I wrote down all of the names to list, but I'll leave it there. If you're interested, I can send, or I can even put it in the chat. This is a phenomenon, and it is possible also in Canaan, the land of the Israelites, before it became Jerusalem. There was the Bible mentions these Kadeshim, which were high priests of the goddess Asherah. And there's the inference that they were performing sacred prostitution. So what does that mean, sacred prostitution? The idea that interacting with a god might involve sacred sex. I mean, that of course has to be destroyed by the overarching monotheistic heteropatriarchal religious framework. So in my mythology, the Mary Magdalene character is a temple prostitute, but the word prostitute isn't even used. I mean, it's just, in my mythology, sexuality is a deep part of interaction with the divine. And so there's no need to create the word priestex, and of course I do two X's instead of S's, implies that sort of sexuality is part of the process of interacting with and knowing these gods. And that's also strategic, because when a viewer encounters my mythology and they see this figure, and they understand that this, I'm recoding iconographic images of Mary Magdalene and using those as source code for this character, I'm also complicating the conception that a prostitute was someone outside of the spiritual domain. And this is, again, as I specified before, that I am an artist first. I'm a religious scholar to support my artwork, but I have a freedom that a lot of religious scholars don't have, is that I do encounter this information, but I can make with it what I like. I produce composites. I work it all together. But I also, I think that it's important that we, first of all, that we, in queering the Bible, I think it's first of all important that everybody knows that there is no single mention of Mary Magdalene being a prostitute in the sacred text. So going back to what I said at the beginning, people that say the Bible says, well, the Bible does not say that she was a prostitute. But secondly, that this notion that making her a prostitute is a way to take away her spiritual power, that is also rooted in a gross heteropatriarchal mode that sees sexuality itself as villainous. So reconstructing and reconstituting Magdalene, for me, is very much about challenging that narrative. And I think that I guess I wanted to say, I think I said it before, that I feel the Magdalene series is doing this reconstruction work because all of the artists and scholars and thinkers and people that this project has invited and generated, we are all complicating, deconstructing, reconstructing, playing with, and encircling this constellation of ideas that the public believes they understand as a cohesive entity, and Mary Magdalene is not. So yeah, I think I will leave it there and hopefully roll into a conversation. I guess I wanted to sort of showcase that process of artistic reconstruction while I was speaking, because I also believe that part of what I'm doing as an artist, reinventing or reconstructing a religion as art, is to show pathways that we can all reconstruct the mythologies that we grow up with that are damaging. I don't believe, and people, there's also debate and disagreement in this area as well. I don't think it's helpful to eradicate simply the harmful narratives. I believe they have to be transformed because we grow up with them. They are embedded within us. So although we would like to reject the abusive, oppressive models that have limited us, I think I advocate for artistic transformation as opposed to pushing aside. And I think we know that in psychology too, right? The things that we push away from ourselves have more power to take over us than those that we look at and take apart. And so understanding that the Magdalene series has been happening since 2018, but that this is, even I was really excited by the idea that it was a year of artistic programming exploring this phenomenon. I also hope that this inspires others to kind of take these archetypes and lay them on the table and invite artists, thinkers, cultural producers, etc., to all deconstruct and reconstruct collaboratively. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have been able to share as a part of this I argue reconstruction, and hopefully we can now have a conversation about it. So thank you for your attention. I hope the audio and video is okay. And now, Kimberly, let's roll to the next phase.
Let's have the chats. Yeah, thanks so much, Em. It was really great to hear you speak about your work, and especially all of the different sort of theological and philosophical ideas that go into it. So I think there's a lot for us to talk about and unpack, and I'm excited to do that. And we have one question so far from Alice, but I would encourage everyone to start writing in your questions now that I'm sure have come up while you were engaged in the talk. But to start off with, so Alice was asking, she says, I loved watching the process of your creating these new kinds of creatures. Do they become animated and they look like they might move into a narrative? And I might add on to that kind of a question that came up for me as well that's sort of related, I think. I was just curious about how you came to the aesthetic of your mythology, because it looks to me to be somewhat influenced by maybe science fiction potentially. And I was just wondering if there are any particular artists whose work have like inspired your aesthetic as well.
Love it, love it, love it. Hi, Alice, dear. Yes, yes, thank you. Well, okay, I think both questions kind of can merge, so I'll just riff off of them. Yeah, I had always been drawn to sci-fi, but I realized, actually, this was also part of the PhD. Well, actually, I'll share this because it's quite interesting. When you do a PhD, normally you have to do an annotated bibliography, meaning you have to read like 200 dense theory books and write something about each one of them. But because I was doing an artistic PhD, my supervisor said, okay, I want you to write, half a page for every sci-fi fantasy myth that you've ever read or watched. And so I did. I had over 150. And what I realized through writing that was that each work of science fiction and fantasy that I was drawn to, I was looking for the religions inside of them. And I was looking for the ways in which belief systems functioned, which helped me to understand that part of my aesthetic is actually about fusing sci-fi and religiosity and finding religiosity in almost all fantasy and sci-fi. But also, I grew up in the 80s. Well, no, I was born in 1984, but sci-fi was a kind of religious experience. And I realized that, even certain synth sounds and certain starscapes, it's not an accident that sci-fi is linked with this, because the stars are heaven. We've constantly been looking up in terms of producing and creating spiritual stories. Sci-fi was the latest iteration of that. And I think it was, outside of the precincts of dominant religion. But as I found in my annotated bibliography, there's not one piece of speculative fiction that I've looked at that doesn't have a religious component, that doesn't think about what kind of belief system is going to, how will our belief systems change when we're on Mars if Elon has his way? I mean, our spirituality is, merged around, we have a moon and it's an earth and we have a certain perspective. How does that change when we hit the stars? So these questions are all kind of whirling in me as I do this. In terms of Alice, thank you for the question. I am right now making a VR chapel, and as part of it, one of the principal kind of godexes in my mythology has been made into a fully functioning avatar. So there is that level of these creatures coming to life. But I also, in my performance work, I perform as the characters in the mythology. So I use body paint. I have prosthetic breasts. I present as those characters. Also, there's a graphic novel, and I have a big dream of doing a rotoscope feature-length film, which, rotoscope from Waking Life, so it would be drawn like that, but it would have movement. But that's very, very ambitious, and I need a lot of funding, if anyone knows anyone. But it's important. I think my final note on that will be that growing up, I was a nerd, and I obviously loved comics, but my favorite comic was the X-Men. And I only realized much later how queer the X-Men were. They're basically mutants that start to have, abnormal powers, which make them freaks and makes them dangerous. But then Professor Xavier produces a school where these beings can come and learn how to harness their difference and get really cool outfits and like design their own drag queen names. Now I understand how fundamentally queer that narrative is. And, you know, the idea of the outcasts and mutants, and actually going to art school for me, I think was very similar to going to mutant school, learning how to harness your strange gift, which when you were younger was a burden. And then as you got older, you developed it. So I'm intentionally invoking kind of a comic book aesthetic and referencing kind of X-Men comics of the 80s, because that was also unknowingly to me, that was a queer refuge for me. And I'm interested also in this kind of parallel or of taking sort of religious iconographies, particularly Renaissance images, because the general public are usually quite exposed to those types of images. It also creates an opening point, a portal, because I'm not interested in art just talking to art. So by using this flashy, recognizable aesthetic, I also try to bring people in.
Great, thank you. We have another question that came in. This one's from Brian. And they are asking, why choose to ultimately make art against another context?
Okay, Brian, it would be probably helpful to have a conversation, because I don't know that I would say that what I'm doing is against. I think that, or at least what I'm trying to articulate, is that I am going quite deep into the complexity of, let's say, religion or Magdalene or these mythologies. If I am against anything, it would be the exclusivity of the spiritual for one group and not another. So I am creating access points, actually for a lot of, I would even call them spiritual refugees. Many people, and actually I will make this note, that so many of the queer people that I speak to, in some way or another, when they were young, were somehow drawn to having a role in religion. And this I find extremely compelling. It wasn't just me. I mean, this whole thing of the altar boys and also people that are predisposed towards certain mystical roles, but it's very interesting that a lot of queer people were deeply damaged by being excluded, not simply because it's yet another thing we're excluded from, but because they were particularly drawn to the ritual positionality that religion provided, or the kind of spiritual framework that was offered. And so I find this very interesting. By excluding so many queer people, I think religions generally actually cut out potential leaders. And as I argue, I believe religion itself is quite queer fundamentally, and I can argue that. I guess that sounds like I am against it, but I'm not. And anyone who knows me, I would actually argue that I'm deeply religious about art. I actually am quite monastic in my practice, but I think that by creating a queer religion as art, that itself can be read as an attack on the institution of religion. But I mean, what is the institution of religion? There are so many different institutions of religion. If in fact it is read as that attack, that is just an opening point for a conversation. And just so you know, I've done like several projects, most notably in Hamburg, just before COVID, where I've performed in churches, and I've been welcomed by priests and the priest in particular that invited me to perform at the St. Katharinen Church in Hamburg. Many members of his congregation were threatened by my work, and he said it's our responsibility to listen. And he and I nerded out about theology for 3 hours when we met, which is how he trusted me to be able to occupy that stage. And I even said, you know, should I be naked with 6 express on the altar? And he said, of course. In the end, I chose not to. I actually I leaned towards modesty, even just for my own practice, but I was given free rein. And he said it's our job. He said it was his job, even as a practitioner of the faith, to facilitate challenging conversations about the faith. But I also tried, as I'm making a space opera. So, you know, even if what I'm doing is challenging, I think it goes down a little bit easier because it's in a format that is accessible. However, inevitably there is a clash. However, I've never once actually encountered strong religious resistance to my work, which surprises me, actually.
Great, thank you. Brian, I'm not sure if you have any follow-up for that, or if anybody else has any other questions. I don't have any at the moment, but do type in your questions if anything comes up. I can also allow people to talk if anybody's interested in, you know, having that option. You could also just write that and, oh wait, there's more questions now. Okay.
Oh, good. Okay. I can't see anything, so it's also very, yeah.
No worries, I got you. So Brian, I think Brian was happy with that answer. He said amazing and thank you. And we have a new question from Elena. Could you talk a bit about prayer within your religion and mythology, and what is a prayer for you?
Okay, so, you know, again, this is the thing, because I also did durational lecture performance where I would like talk for 8 hours. So this is another reason why I have to keep the time. And there's so many rabbit holes we could go down. I didn't talk about the fact that I'm a witch. I'm a witch. And one of the things that I find very interesting in terms of practicing kind of a hybrid form of witchcraft is the difference between a spell and a prayer. And from my perspective, a spell is more active, whereas a prayer is more passive. So in prayer, you are asking for something to be granted or for something to happen. When you compose a spell, you are saying, I am willing this into being. And that those have very different energies. I'm more drawn to the active stance. And so that factors into my mythology. So in effect, and sorry, briefly, I should note that in magic, in the practice of magic, spell comes from spelling. And a book of spells is called a grimoire that comes from grammar. So the whole process of setting forth one's intent is rooted in language. Obviously, in the ancient world, the vast majority of people were illiterate. So if you went to a priest in pagan times, or arguably also in Judeo-Christian times, they would literally write out a spell. I mean, they would write something out, and that was magical because they had the power to put something down that only they could read or only other people could read. So putting forth a spell is actually sort of putting your intention into the universe, blasting it into the universe. In my invented religion, spelling is just part of life. I mean, people summoning the things that they want to summon is just part of everyday practice. But I think the equivalent of prayer in my religion is the concept of surrender. And it's called a Mahdi in the queer language. And there's a central chant. Actually, I put on Instagram today a short video reel, and the audio for that is the chant of a Mahdi, which basically says whenever anything is happening, the holiest thing you can do is surrender to it. And that's not passive. It's in fact active, because you are surrendering to, like even today with potential technical glitches. And, you know, I talked before with Francesca, who has been so lovely and helpful with the tech support. But, you know, we said we ride the chaos, we work with it. And so the second, you know, things are not going as you thought they would go, or you seem to be burdened by an onslaught of unintended events, the holiest thing you can do is stop and chant the Amadi, which reminds you to surrender to all things and to listen and to be guided, and basically how to ride the chaos. So that, I feel, at least atmospherically, is like prayer. Whereas making a spell is something more like making a sculpture or making an artwork or you know, renovating your kitchen. Stopping and surrendering and stopping the multitudes of voices that are saying this is unwanted, it shouldn't be like this, or blah blah blah, and saying no, we collectively, the multiplicity that is us, we surrender to this. That's the holiest thing that someone could do in my invented religion. Hence why there's a central chant that is repeated again and again. And also it factors into the mythology, because when the monotheistic kind of colonizing religion starts to sweep across the galaxy and take over worlds, there are those who wish to fight against it, but then there's also a sort of a profound spiritual group that says, no, we have to surrender to this, but that doesn't mean we accept it. It means we have to work with it, and we have to work around it. And over the course of my mythology, also greatly influenced by Gnostic thinking, over their long imprisonment, they do eventually liberate Sophia, and that only comes from surrender. So prayer, not so much, but surrender, yes, and putting forth intention. I think that magic and art are basically the same thing. I mean, when you make art, you have this image in your head, or you have an idea or a feeling, and then you make it reality. That is the essence of magic. And one of the underlying themes of the mythology is that religion is the domestication of magic. And so religion uses magic, but magic is free. And magic, and there's a beautiful poem by Leonard Cohen performed by Buffy St. Marie, which actually I suggest everyone to listen to it. I think it's just called Magic. I would look it up. That describes exactly the way that my mythology looks at and performs the tension and the dynamism that exists between what we call religion and the energy that we call magic.
Great, thank you. That sort of, it reminds me of a quote from J.D. Salinger's Franny and Zoe book, where I think it says "pray without ceasing" in it, and it's kind of like a mantra and sort of reminds me of this idea of surrender. But anyways, I don't see any other questions right now, but again, do type them in if you have any. But I have another question for you. I talked a lot in your mythology about sort of like origins and that type of idea. So I was just wondering, kind of maybe on the flip side of that, how you deal with, or what sort of ideas you have about like this concept of the afterlife, because I know in like Christian religion that's like a huge part of it, right? So I was just wondering how you kind of address that, if at all.
It's so lovely you ask. This whole project, I swear to God, I just swear to God, that's funny. I swear to the goddess, this project is rife with synchronicities. I'm literally also working on the afterlife part right now. And it's in my mythology, and arguably I guess I would say, because I mean I've looked at several religions and several mystical systems, but the recycling of souls is the machinery of my universe. So reincarnation is fundamental, it's cyclic. Unlike a lot of transcendental religions, which some sects of Buddhism also have, like the idea that there's a kind of a point that you will get to where you are no longer, when you no longer need to incarnate. My mythology doesn't take that. The idea is more embracing the cyclicity of it, and that our job, and it's, again, I'm deeply, you could argue Religionvirus is Gnostic, but I mean, it isn't anything, but you could argue that it is, because the whole purpose of incarnating into a physical form is in order to get experience. And in order to train, and this is very fundamental, it also beautifully, this is the synchronous, it connects to the last thing we just talked about. The space between when you imagine something and it becoming reality. The benefit of being in a material universe with time and space is that there is space between the thought or the idea and its realization. Meaning, you can think about it carefully before you do it. You can solve some problems. A good friend might say, maybe don't do it that way, do it this way. And you can learn how to be responsible for what you imagine. When you are not in a body, there is no time. So whatever you conceive becomes immediately. So material in Religionvirus, in the mythology, material existence is basically a university for souls to learn how to be responsible for what they create, because we are inevitably producing realities constantly. But here we have consequence. So we get to see the effects of the choices that we made, and therefore we get to learn from them and make better choices. And again, when our soul container isn't in a body anymore, then we're just, the second you get angry, you blast a huge angry universe into being. So learning how to stop that before it happens is part of the training ground. And this is factoring in the way that, like, it's possible that that beings don't need corporeal forms anymore in the evolutionary state. You might not need a body anymore, but at least within my theology, that soul container maintains itself and is constantly growing. And in my invented language, this is also, with the invented language, I get to do some things. Really, it's only for the nerds. It's only for the nerds that are going to read it and go really deep into it. But, you know, the word for soul is the same word as the word for library. And so the idea of the soul is actually like a receptacle of information. And the being, the animate being, is one that has continuous access to this library of information. And that information is what we summon and use to make our choices and to explore. So the development of what, yeah, and even again, so if we think about other languages, and this is also very important, because if we only think in terms of our own language, we only think of one reality. And other languages have different ways of expressing things and different innuendos. In mine, the fact that the soul is a library is also rooted in the idea that, yeah, it's a library of gnosis, a library of experiences that you've gathered, which contribute to the developing consciousness of the entire universe, which we all are, and all the characters. So my gods in my mythology are basically bioartists that learn how to grow universes, and they're performing artistic experiments with existence. they're not the God. They're just artists like us. And there's an endless, how would you say it? Macro to micro. It is endless in terms of what you can achieve and what happens when you've created a whole universe. What happens next? The soul, the library, is continuously evolving into to respond to new challenges and to gain more gnosis.
Okay, so we have a question from Amanda Coogan now. Hi, Amanda. She said, fascinating talk. Can you speak to how embodiment intersects with your live performances, if at all?
Of course. Hi, Amanda. Yeah, I mean, this is, I guess, one of the central features that I do produce artifacts. I produce all of the set for religion, to everything that I talked about, the transmediality of the church, the architecture, the iconography, the 2D, 3D, the music. I produce all of that. But I don't believe that alone would produce a religious experience amongst the public. It is the embodied, performative, ritual encounter that I've been doing. And Amanda, of course, is a performance artist, and we we met through being performers. I started off as a performer. I mean, I started off wanting to make rituals. And as I made more and more rituals, that's when it kind of began to turn into a religion. And that's when all of the other stuff started to come out. Of course, I always liked drawing and I liked making things, but I felt an urgency, actually a queer urgency, to perform sort of queer rituals in this. Yeah. I don't even know how I would describe it. When I started, my first major sort of performance was in New York in a show called A.A. Bronson's School for Young Shamans in 2008. And then this kind of the queer witch, the queer spiritual being model was like kind of just emerging. Now it's more developed. A.A. Bronson was a leader of that. And I understood, like, okay, there is a massive level of or a massive importance to this, to the queer embodiment of ritual space. And I realized that. I mean, of course, you could look back at sort of performance broadly as you know, as the embodiment of alternate subjectivities being performed, but I think that ritual component, people are starving for it, because we dismantled the meta-narrative of religion, the overarching, you know, oppressive capacities of religion. But we need that ritual, and we need that sweaty encounter. And I do durational performance like Amanda and like many others, that's grueling, that's very, very challenging and difficult. It's like the performance of sacrifice. That itself is, I mean, if you think about Christ on the cross, the transformative, I mean, I'm sure I'm not everyone, I'm sure that you've all heard this before, but the idea that all of the depictions of Jesus on the cross are proto-performance documentation, that this event itself was so memorable because he performed his suffering on behalf of us. We do that too. And I also, I paint my body like my characters, and then I do grueling, intensive, durational rituals, which is interesting because when I just did one in France like 3 weeks ago. I was painted like kind of turquoise with this geometric pink design and 6 artificial breasts in a big show, and I was sitting holding a dead fish for 5 hours. And basically, when people would see me, of course, from the distance, they would assume I was a sculpture. And then when they got a little bit closer, they saw I was breathing. But because of the bright aesthetic and everything, there's like a kind of a playful energy that they enter it with. And then they see that I'm sweating and freezing cold and, you know, all of that stuff. And that I'm embodying, and even, I mean, there's a kind of not accusation, but question, like, you know, is M. Dudeck really like a witch, or is this just like a sham, like an arty, kind of thing? This is the thing about performing embodiment in that capacity, that I don't get asked that after someone has seen a performance, because they see that idea in form. And I think that the positionality of the charismatic leader, that's quite typical for religions and cults. Arguably, religions are cults and cults are religions. But I think that as performers, we are embodying a ritual positionality, whether or not we engage with it as such. I think it's inherent. But the added element of my invented religion means that when someone sees me doing something, embodying it, and then they learn that I've designed and constructed all the apparatus around it to support it, I think that's partly what creates this religious experience. I think it's seeing the authenticity of a sacrificial act, really, and a performance of, or a ritual performance, let's say, aligned with the aesthetic. And so actually, maybe this is a great way to end it, because I end with what I was saying originally. I make all this stuff now, and I'm interested in making all this stuff, and I'm increasingly interested in how all of it works together to produce this experience. But at its core, it wouldn't work if it didn't have my sweating body at the center of it, and if it didn't have that fundamental embodiment coded within its core.
Great, thank you. And I think that's probably a good place to wrap up here, as I don't see any more questions. Just before we let you go and say goodbye to everybody, maybe you could tell us where the best place is to access your work.
Yes, please. So there's a few. So I'm M. Dudeck, but my name is Michael, and my website is still michaeldudeck.com. mdudeck.com is currently in production, and it'll premiere in January 2023. But for now, michaeldudeck.com. But I also have produced, as part of the Hamburg Machina Festival, an online digital temple, which is an artwork, a web-based artwork, and you can reach it at www.templeofartifice.com or www.religionvirus, with a dot between the R and the us. So religionvire.us. On Instagram, I'm Religionvirus. And on Facebook, I'm still Michael Dudeck, because they won't let me become M. That's another like policing entity. I mean, all of those, I could post them, but I think those are probably accessible. If you just also Google me, you'll get to my website, and there's contact there. So I'm also very open to conversations, and maybe I'll do a last little plug, because one of the central features of my approach to religion as a multimedia production that kind of emerged in the last few years is that Religionvirus, I discovered or realized that in order for my project to be conceptually sound, I need a production team. It can't just be me, because all of those artworks, all of the, everything that I brought up was made by specialists, each in their own field. So now Religionvirus is kind of turning into a hybrid production company with brilliant specialists of all kinds. So if anyone is interested and has some skill set that they might be interested in contributing, we're interested. So I just put that out to anyone who might be thinking about it. And thank you for your time and attention, and thank you to everyone from Rua Red for hosting me, and thank you, Alice and Amanda, for making this happen.